Today I'm showing you my Bachmann train's HO scale Lima Berkshire, which I recently picked up for Christmas 2017. The video also shows the modifications I did to the locomotive to improve its performance. The MSRP of the Lima Berkshire is $269 for the DCC silent version and $349 for the DCC sound version. Bachmann's MSRP is highly inflated, so these things are usually sold for half of the MSRP. I paid $125 for my DCC silent version, and you can routinely find the sound version for $199. My suggestion is, if you're serious about having sound in this thing, buy the silent version of the model and add your own sound decoder. If you don't need sound, just buy the silent version and replace the factory decoder with a better silent decoder, because it is worth it in the long run. More on that later. This isn't going to be a full review, so I'm not going to go over the prototype details. If you want to learn more about Pere Marquette 1225's history and its influence on the Polar Express book and film, you are free to look up on someone else's video on the subject. So out of the box, the locomotive looks pretty good for a Bachmann. Here it is next to the Scale Trains Tier 4, which is one of the most detailed locomotives I have. The Bachmann Berkshire has a good amount of separately applied detail parts in combination with motor-on details. Definitely not the best looking Bachmann steam locomotive by any means, but it's good enough. The cold load on the tender looks especially good. The trucks lack some details, but for the price, I will give it a pass. The first problem with this thing is the coupler height. Bachmann's own couplers have a very thin coupler shank, so the coupler has a tendency to sag. Aftermarket couplers with thicker shanks will fix the sagging problem. For this thing, I used a McHenry coupler with Velta at the front and a KD158 scale head whisker coupler at the back. The back coupler is still a little low, but not so low that it bothers me, so I'm just going to leave it as is for now. The wheels appear to be in gauge, which is good. The performance of this thing is terrible out of the box. As most people will say, it runs like a Bachmann. It constantly jerks at low speeds and stalls on curves. This is due to the decoder that Bachmann puts in their DCC silent models. I really wish Bachmann didn't install these decoders, because they actually hinder the locomotive's performance. What you see on the video is the actual performance of the locomotive out of the box. I am not pushing or pulling it in any way. It just randomly stalls on its own when you hit up a curve. In fact, it is so bad at low speeds, I couldn't get a proper minimum speed reading out of the speedometer. I didn't film the drawbar pull, but I recall it was 1.9 ounces out of the box, or 54 grams, which is about 26 freight cars, so it's not exactly a good puller either. To give this locomotive a fighting chance at running properly, I am replacing the factory decoder with an ESU Loc Sound Select decoder. You might ask, why didn't I just get a sound equipped model instead? The primary reason is that because the Soundtrax decoder on the sound equipped models is what they call a sound value decoder, it isn't a full function decoder, which means that there are certain things that you can't adjust to fine tune the locomotive's performance. As I already have a bunch of ESU decoders just sitting around in my parts box, I don't have to buy a new decoder for this thing. Bachmann does offer all of the documentation on their website, so you can just refer to it and do your own repairs if you wish. I am going to go into the part service diagrams and information page, and then product reference, then search for the Berkshire parts diagram. So you can see that the tender shell is secured to the tender chassis with these 4 screws. So all we have to do is to loosen the 4 screws and the tender shell should come off. Be very careful, as the rear light LED wires are taped to the tender, so don't go ripping it off by accident when you remove the tender shell. Use a pair of ESD tweezers to pull the factory decoder out of the circuit board, and then don't ever use it again. Since I am doing a sound decoder install, I am also going to temporarily take off the circuit board and the 2 weight pieces under it. You can see that there's a speaker provision for a round speaker, but since I don't have the corresponding round speaker, I'm just going to use an iPhone speaker instead. I stick a piece of double-sided foam tape on the speaker's flat side, and then position the speaker with its flat side facing up, in a way where it fits nicely in the space under the tender weights. Take one of the weights and simply press down onto the tender chassis, and the speaker should stick to it. Remove the weight and then turn it over to securely press the speaker into place. Now that the speaker is installed, I screw the weights and circuit board back in place and plug in the decoder into the 8-pin socket. Just make sure that the plug of the decoder is not in backwards, or else none of your lights will work. The red wire corresponds to pin number 8 on the circuit board. The tender goes back together, then the locomotive can be tested. You're hearing diesel sounds because the decoder was last used in a diesel locomotive. I sold the diesel which the decoder was installed in, and then kept the decoder for future use. For now, I'm just going to make sure that the sound is working and the locomotive runs. The second thing I'm going to do is to add extra weight to the locomotive. Adding weight to the locomotive will do two things. The first thing is that the extra weight will improve the locomotive's pulling power. The second thing is that I am going to put weight at the front of the locomotive, thus shifting the center of the gravity of the locomotive forward. This helps prevent derailment of the pilot truck, which is a very common problem on these Bachmann steam engines. There are 3 screws securing the engine shell to the engine chassis. One of the screws is under the pilot truck, and the 2 other screws are under the trailing truck. I am using tungsten putty, which is usually used as fishing weight. It has a density of 10 grams per cubic centimeter, and it has the same consistency as sticky tack, and can be easily applied to the inside of the boiler with a toothpick or wooden dowel. I was able to fit 75 grams of the stuff into the boiler, sealing it off with a piece of wax paper so that the tungsten putty doesn't stick to the chassis of the locomotive. It is also a good idea to tape off the exposed bracket, which is holding the worm gear in place so that the tungsten putty doesn't accidentally get into the gears of the locomotive. In the end, the locomotive weighs in at 505 grams, compared to just 430 grams out of the box. The extra weight improves the drawbar pull from 1.9 ounces to 2.7 ounces. 2.7 ounces is 77 grams, which translates to 38 freight cars on level track, which is not epically impressive by any means, but it is much better than the stock pulling power. The final thing to do is to load up the ESU full throttle steam sound file into the locomotive. I am using sound file number 73490, which is designed for the Union Pacific 484 Northern locomotives, but it is a pretty good stand-in for the Pere Marquette 1225. After the sound file is loaded, I will fine-tune the decoder, braking the locomotive first, then adjust CV54 for the automatic back EMF calibration. The automatic back EMF calibration allows the locomotive to run at a low speed of just 0.6 scale miles per hour, which is much better than the factory decoder. I then calibrate the top speed to 50 miles per hour so that it matches all my other locomotives. If you want to learn more about speed matching, be sure to check out my previous video where I talk about speed matching in detail. The last thing to do is to adjust the steam chuff rates. Set the locomotive to speed step 1 and time how long it takes for the locomotive drive wheels to do a full revolution. Divide that number by 4 and that will be the value of steam chuffs at step 1. For my locomotive, this value is 235, which means it takes 7.5 times 4, which is 30 seconds for the driving wheels to do 1 rotation. The adjustment at higher speed steps dictate how fast the chuffs increase as you increase the speed steps. For this parameter, you will have to adjust the slider and then verify if the chuffs line up with the wheel turns at higher speeds. There should be 4 chuffs per revolution. My value for this locomotive is 68. The ESU full throttle steam plow has a heavy mode which is assigned to function 9. When you press function 9, the locomotive speed will be locked, and then you can turn the throttle up to simulate a heavy chuff sound emitted by the locomotive when it is pulling a heavy load up the hill. There is also a coast mode function, which is assigned to function 4. When you press function 4, the chuff sounds will disappear to simulate the locomotive coasting downhill. This concludes the video of my Bachmann Lima Berkshire locomotive, decorated as Pere Marquette 1225, with added weight to the boiler for extra pulling power, and an ESU low sound select decoder in place of the factory decoder for smooth motor control and amazing sounds.